Welcome to another episode of Well-Adjusted Mama. This is a podcast dedicated to educating and empowering women from preconception, pregnancy, birth, and through early motherhood on wellness lifestyle. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Brayton. I'm a maternity pediatric chiropractor, functional medicine practitioner, and mother who has hand-selected experts and natural holistic healthcare specialties to shine light on options and choices during this exciting phase of a woman's life. Today's episode is From Health Struggles to Wellness Advocate with Cameron George. Cameron is an acclaimed researcher, entrepreneur, and visionary founder of TRU KAVA, a pioneering company founded in 2019 that sets the standard for kava quality, safety, and education in the mainstream market. As a leading authority on kava and the co-founder of the International Kava Coalition, Cameron is leading a movement to establish kava as the premier natural alternative to alcohol, championing its use as a healthy social elixir in the growing sober curious movement. Cameron's journey began during his battle with a debilitating autoimmune condition. After discovering the therapeutic benefits of traditional kava, he immersed himself in extensive research, collaborating with the world's foremost experts on plant medicine and neurorehabilitation. His dedication to understanding kava's profound potential led him to create TRU KAVA, where he developed safe, user-friendly products designed to deliver the full therapeutic effects of traditional kava in a modern, convenient format. These efforts are aimed at transforming how modern society approaches both mental health and social connection. Cameron has worked with a robust network of functional medicine physicians, contributing to the development of therapeutic protocols for anxiety, PTSD, and chronic illness. His expertise also spans a wide array of psychoactive plant medicines, where he explores their potential in mental health and neurorehabilitation. Cameron has shared his insights on numerous top-charted podcasts, including The Human Upgrade with Dave Asprey, The Lifestylist Podcast with Luke Story, The Dr. Josh Axe Show, Ben Greenfield Life Podcast, The Wellness Mama Podcast, and Wellness and Wisdom Podcast with Josh Trent. Hi, Cameron. Welcome to the show. I'm very excited to have you on today.
Great to be here. Thank you very much.
Yes. So I always love it when my guest has like such a personal story that kind of inspired their purpose and passion in life. So I'd love to start there with you talking about your health journey and kind of how you came to where you're at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I always kind of preface it right out of the gate with, I kind of have a process or story, personal experience of how I got into this stuff, not that dissimilar from a lot of other people that kind of do the kind of work that we do, health and wellness and personal development and fitness, and just people who are kind of focused on problem resolution and trying to make tomorrow better than today. A lot of the times whenever people get into this stuff, probably, most of the time, it comes from some level of experience with adversity or having your back up against the wall, being in a state of desperation. We kind of use the term from pain to purpose. It's kind of a pain to purpose journey. So that was exactly my situation. Like I definitely would have probably never ventured into the world of this like South Pacific plant medicine or mental optimization or mental health or neurorehabilitation or any of the areas that I've been, lucky to work in, had I not gone through those things myself or just kind of been immersed in it and had like a, pretty severe encounter with the disease process. So long story short, I got really sick, like as a young guy in my early 20s, kind of had a total collapse of my health. And what it ended up being was it was one of these sort of modern day neurotoxin induced, chronic autoimmune conditions, basically, these neurotoxic conditions that are so common today. And whenever it happened to me, though, there wasn't near as much circulating information on these kind of syndrome illnesses that were becoming more common, but not like explosive like you see them today, right? Where it's like almost everybody knows someone who has a quote unquote unexplainable illness, whether it be brain fog or fatigue, or whether it be gut issues, whether it be hormone issues, whether it be neurological issues, whether it be mood issues. There's so much sort of low grade dysfunction that's, precipitous in the culture right now. And a lot of it, if not most of it, is induced environmentally via, exposure to different stressors and traumas. So I was, pretty high functioning guy in my early 20s. I was a competitive distance runner in college in the NCAA, and I was working multiple jobs at the same time as going to university, getting my degree and everything, just like normal person would. And I kind of had this very, very slow, then all at once kind of descent into like pretty severe dysfunction. I basically got fatigued and depressed and wasn't recovering and just thought I was overtraining. So then I backed off and it wasn't getting better. Then it got to be like pretty severe where it was like really difficult to make it through the day just from a fatigue standpoint. But then also, but my system was so exhausted, I just wasn't making the right neurochemistry to actually feel good and to be healthy, happy, motivated. And I just continued to go down this kind of spiraling cycle of diminishment and eventually ended up in a psychiatrist's office. And then I was prescribed a handful of pharmaceutical drugs, of course. And then that took everything to a whole nother level. So obviously, whenever you already have a metabolic condition or a metabolic disease that's induced by a lot of cumulative stressors and traumas, and in my case, neurotoxins. I was exposed to black mold and the Stachybotrys mold in an apartment that I was in. I had a pretty horrific diet, like a lot of us did, especially growing up in the 90s, that we now know. A lot of things that we didn't know back then, that most people didn't know back then. And then I had a few other different exposures. I had, amalgam fillings. And so I had mercury exposures from that and had high heavy metal levels and stuff. So, but basically I kind of had this, once I went on the pharmaceutical drugs and, Adderall was one of the main ones. That was a complete disaster because it's like if you have a metabolic condition and then you put a heavy psychostimulant in the brain or in the system, it's just to basically try to compensate for that. Those drugs, they work on a really basic principle of basically borrowing from tomorrow's resources to pay for today, right? You take a psychostimulant or if you take a relaxant of some kind, some of those drugs obviously can be, very useful in certain clinical settings, especially acute clinical settings. But really what you're doing is not actually creating any more resources or available chemistry for the body to focus or to upregulate your mood or get an antidepressant effect or to relax your nervous system. Like I said, you're just kind of borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today by taking a synthetic molecule that's foreign to the body that basically plugs into receptors and just basically dumps your available stores of that chemical that modulates that. And so inexorably, it kind of works like a credit card with the brain instead of, if your brain chemistry is like a currency that your body creates, you're sort of borrowing it on credit whenever you're doing that. So when you're already bankrupt and then you charge more, you end up more bankrupt. And that's where severe withdrawal and these things come from and just these neurochemical imbalances. So it was a compound effect from a lot of toxic exposures, traumas, and inflammation induced by diet and environment, and then heavy pharmaceutical drugs on top of it. And then basically the bottom fell out and I descended into a level of dysfunction that actually rendered me handicapped and was really unable to move around and had pretty severe cognitive deficits.
Oh my God. And you were still in college?
Yeah, well, I had to essentially drop out and basically it got so bad I couldn't drive anymore. I basically just couldn't do hardly anything but just sit at a computer and literally spend all day just scouring medical and scientific literature and articles and to try to piece together what had happened, because the only thing I had available to me, especially in the part of the country that I'm from, which is Northwest Arkansas, especially at the time, certainly wasn't one of the more health progressive parts of the country that had anything outside of the allopathic framework. So
there wasn't a lot of functional medicine available.
Yeah, exactly. There's virtually none. And so that just wasn't part of our world. And again, that's kind of why I ended up on psych meds and stuff too, just because that was basically the option, even though intuitively I felt that wasn't going to fix the problem. So that became really, really clear to me once things got so much worse. So then it was basically back to square one. I'm dysfunctional, totally handicapped, all distractions taken away from me, which ended up being a blessing in the long term, but just spent the next 8 years doing nothing but just curating information.
8 years, Cameron?
Yeah, it was almost actually total a little longer than that.
You lost 8 years of your life.
Yeah. My entire 20s, I spent severely sick. And there was about 2 years of that where I was near death sick, had dwindled down to a very, very low weight. Part of the condition, whenever a lot of these sort of unexplainable autoimmune conditions, I say unexplainable, they are explainable now, but at the time and to most people, it feels unexplainable because there's not just one set of symptoms that can be categorized and medicated and labeled a specific label. You're getting these sort of clusters of symptoms that you can put all kinds of labels on them, and you can get like 30 different diagnoses, and that's becoming more and more common. And basically that's just because there's a pathology that's going on that's driven by chronic inflammation, that's driven by stressors, traumas, toxins, and it can manifest depending on your genetic susceptibility and pop up in different places in the body. But essentially, most of these chronic illnesses are all autoimmune in component that are driven by inflammation. And chronic inflammation, when you think of chronic inflammation, think of chronic irritation. It's basically an accumulation of these different stressors and traumas. If the body's a metaphorical bucket, we use this metaphor all the time. Every stress in your life, the emotional stress at work or with the kids or with the family or the relationship, is a drop in the bucket that creates chemistry and cortisol, inflammation in your body. Every exposure to toxins, things that you eat, drink, put on your skin, pesticides you're exposed to, pharmaceutical drugs, is another drop in the bucket or multiple drops in the bucket. And then, other stressors too, even, the stressors that we have from all of the EMF exposure that we're exposed to, for example, right? Which is just something that's being talked about more and more, but we know that it actually is like most of these electric fields, especially that come from cell phones and stuff, is a form of radiation that we're just kind of bathing in. So that's just another example, but there's just a lot. We just live in a pseudo-artificial world with a lot of foreign molecules and foreign energies in it. And our bodies it's hard for us to adapt to it because it's changing and building up so quickly. So whenever the bucket fills up, some people have genetically smaller buckets than others, but whenever the bucket fills up, then you start expressing the symptoms of your genetic weakness. And that can be cancer, that can be autoimmune disease, that can be any number of these things, cognitive dysfunction, or, any of these things. And then some people like myself almost certainly have, genetically smaller buckets with kind of more faulty detox pathways. So maybe I wasn't getting rid of as much as I was exposed to. And we call it a perfect storm. So why a guy who's highly functional at the time loses his whole life for a whole decade when other people exposed to similar things didn't, it's a complex equation there. But it is important. But the thing is that we're all exposed to enough that it eventually gets everybody. And that's what you're seeing today, right? And that's why this sort of expansion and awareness into everything that we're eating and breathing and drinking, that's why you see this kind of movement expanding in the United States, right? With, you have these, whistleblowers on these food companies and agricultural companies and stuff like that are calling for more accountability, because this is becoming undeniable that we have to pay a lot more attention to the way that we integrate with the things that are coming into contact with our body. So,
no doubt. I mean, that's why we see people like Robert Kennedy Jr., who's really stepping up and demanding changes to help our health as a country.
Absolutely. That's all part of it. And that's an incredible development that's been really transformative just in the last year, that we would have thought, most of us that kind of live and work in this space even would have thought that development would have been impossible to happen even just a year ago. But it really is just a testament to how crucial and undeniable the problem has
how
gotten.
Bad things are, right? Enough people are looking and interested in demanding changes, including now our legislators. We see an epidemic of autism, and people are like, what is going on here? What is causing this? We need to know why our children are so sick.
Yeah. And it's at that point where it's reached a level of critical mass where, regardless of what the media tells us, and every single food company, pharmaceutical company that funds them, that all their main sponsors, that's one of the problems. That's one of what RFK talks about, right? Is this capture of media and of regulatory agencies and bodies that just happens as a byproduct of the kind of the system that we live in, or that is devolved into what it is and needs reform and accountability. So it's just become prominent enough and undeniable enough that no matter what the media tells us, I say, the mainstream media that kind of still continuously pushes what is undeniably propaganda, knowingly and unknowingly sometimes.
Yeah, they get paid really well to push
Right.
it, right?
Exactly.
And then if somebody wants to put a different message, but they're not big pharma, then a lot of times that message gets blocked too, because big pharma is like, no, we don't really want that message out there.
Because obviously it cuts into their market share, their resources, their bottom dollar. And it's one of those things that and Bobby talks about this a lot too, right? Not every single person within all of these, mega corporate organizations, of course, is inherently evil. There's so much cognitive dissonance that takes place when you work and your livelihood is invested in a particular trajectory. We experience the life we focus on and not always reality, right? In the sense of when you focus on wanting a certain aspect of reality to be true or to perpetuate and to support it, then your mind just shuts off to everything else and it just kind of makes you not intelligent. So there's a percentage of people within those systems that are like that. And then of course there's a percentage that know and don't care, but it's a mess either way, right? And so it's like it needs accountability and reform. And that's why it's so good. But because it's become so undeniable, regardless of what the mainstream media tells us, people came out in droves to vote to get people like Bobby in place, regardless of what the media was even saying, right? So it really is just a testament to the power of the public and public support and just
people waking up, like it's just like we can't just trust what we watch on TV or, all the advertising that we're just bombarded with. Like we have to really question what we're exposed to and not kind of have that blind sheep mentality that the government has my best interest and they're protecting me, because it's not true. It's just not true. As people and as parents, we have to protect ourselves and our families.
Yeah. And what you said just then is so powerful and so important and a huge takeaway for anyone listening to this. It kind of reminds me of, whenever we were all growing up in junior high or high school, right? You always had your math teacher. And once you get up to the higher level math, right, it becomes increasingly crucial and important to be able to show your work. And what they would actually say is that the work shown is more important than the result that you got. Because if you can show me the trail of the origin of where it came from, then I know that you understand how to think about it. And then you can solve multiple problems instead of just maybe arriving at the correct answer, maybe not even the correct answer. So the answer isn't as important as the trail to get there, in other words. So I always think about this because we're kind of getting to that cultural realization today where whenever someone gives us a message, we're starting to demand that they show their work, right? In the sense of like needing to know where our information is coming from, what vested interests or motivations are behind that conclusion that's been arrived at, and why that, whatever system is delivering that or whatever person is delivering that, why they believe what they believe. Like, where did it come from? And what is the burden of evidence behind that? And then just like when you're shopping around for a doctor, if you have a terminal illness, you don't just go to one person and get one opinion. You go to multiple people, right? And so, the public is smart enough, and this is just comes from the brilliance of the founding fathers of this country and like just how much actual wisdom they actually had in understanding like how important the freedom of speech is, because really the freedom of speech is basically the same as the freedom of thought, because if you can't speak your mind, then you're basically not even really allowed to think, because most people think by processing and expressing information, and it allows for the replication of thought, and it allows for the competition of thought to where the good thoughts can win out from the bad thoughts, right? It's crucial and incredible, and we were in a really, really potentially dangerous situation there for a bit where you literally had at least a whole side of the political spectrum that really stopped believing in that, right? And
with the pandemic, we saw so much censorship and quote unquote disinformation. And it was really startling to see. I actually have a magnet on my fridge that has RFK Jr. on it. And it says, nowhere in history have the good guys been the ones censoring.
Yeah.
Right? Like, good guys don't censor. Like, why? That is the antithesis of what you were just speaking to our founding fathers in the U.S. Like, there was no censorship because they recognized that was bad, right? So when we see censorship happening, we have to really question, where is that coming from and what are the motives?
Right. Well, the purpose of freedom of speech is to let our ideas circulate and go to battle, and for the bad ones to die so that we don't have to.
Right.
It's essential. essentially
and
what
it's about having conversations, right? And there's not even always a bad idea versus a good idea. It's just like, let's all just share and we can all learn from each other. But that also requires being open to hearing other sides of the argument, so to speak.
Right. This is something that's true at every level of reality too, right? It's like, you know how like in certain like Vedic traditions and especially Eastern medicinal, but just sort of Eastern, philosophical, characterizations of reality, they kind of have this principle of as above, so below. Like, right. It's like you look at the stars and you can see a reflection of, the microcosm in the macrocosm. And that seems like a really sort of out there principle. But if you understand, it's like, you ever seen those pictures of a nebula and it looks exactly like the iris of an eye, or the stars in the universe look almost exactly like, neuron clusters in the brain, right? Because there's like a reflection of creation as it expands outward. But so like, the thing about communication and the importance of expression communication is actually just as true for the health of, say, like our own bodies or just organisms in general, right? So like anyone who really understands from a functional or integrated medicine or from a neurobiological or biological biochemical standpoint, what creates and sustains health and what is really the main cause and the sequence that like leads to the degeneration of the individual into disease. And really what it is loss of communication at the cell level, right? That's what allows for the creation of what we call cell senescence, of cells basically going rogue, because it's like, you look in the mirror, right? And you think that you're like this one thing, right? It's like we think, oh, that's Cameron. I look in the mirror and I'm, that's a guy and that's one person. But the reality is that really, if you were to zoom in with an electron microscope, you're really a community of 70 trillion collective cells perfectly working in tandem like synchronized swimmers and jacked into a collective intelligence to where they all know what to do. Right. And they all coordinate together in network.
A lot of bacteria thrown in there too. They're not even our human cells.
Exactly. You've got our human cells, then you've got the microbiome, you get the virome, and you've got all these fungus and protozoa, and just it's an ecosystem. It's an ecosystem of life, of individual units of life that come together. And the thing that creates cohesiveness is energy being present in the system that allows for electrical communication to where they can all communicate and default to this sort of homeostatic balance. When they stop being able to communicate, they don't know what each other needs, then they can't properly orchestrate the right responses to get the bad interference out of the way, the pathological organisms, or keep it at bay or to balance it out. And we just know that that's partly what happens in inflammation, is that when the system gets inflamed, the cell gets blunted and receptors get blunted and they can't communicate, and then they start to degenerate and they can become what we call senescent zombie cells. Then they're precancerous, and then they're, and so that's basically like the origin of cancer or all disease. But I say that only because it's one of those like philosophical understandings, those truths about reality. Whenever you have a loss of expression and communication, that is like the precursor to degeneration.
Cameron, you sound like a chiropractor. Like chiropractic is all about optimizing nervous system function. Why do we want an optimal nervous system? Because that is our communication. That is how our brain communicates with our entire body, and our brain's running the show, right? It's our computer. So if our computer is not optimized, how's the rest of us going to work? Not so well.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's so important. I mean, and that was essentially what happened to me, right? I get exposed to all these stressors and traumas, and I have the genetic susceptibility in place, and it was a perfect storm that it just all blew up. And even being a young guy who was strong and healthy and running 150 miles a week at the time as a distance runner and all this stuff, total collapse because it all came through. Total, breakdown through inflammation, autoimmunity, loss of communication, and it devolves into a chaotic state of complete disembodied homeostasis or dishomeostasis.
It's dis-ease in your body, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So talk to me about how you healed yourself and about your whole purpose, how it's come out of this phoenix rising from the ashes.
It was a gradual process, like I alluded to with the 8 to 10 year thing. It was very, very slow because first, like at the time when I was going through it, we didn't have this amazing, robust network of podcasters, New York Times bestselling authors, biohackers. That was sort of like right before all of that exploded. And a lot of us that kind of got into this, that are sort of in these networks, we collaborate with people. We kind of saw that, and made our contributions into sort of building and contributing to that network. It's a beautiful thing now, which is why people like Bobby are so impactful and stuff. But for me, I basically had to go off and just scour, obviously, the dark corners of the internet at the time, and then travel around and with my family.
It's interesting too. You mentioned being in Arkansas. Like if you were out in California, I think there would have been maybe more resources, or even like if you were in the New York City area where I'm located, just, there was practitioners that were doing this work, right? But not maybe so much where you lived.
Right, exactly. Even those places, it's like, of course you have to know where to go, but at least they were available. You had good chiropractic, you had functional medicine practice back then, you had naturopaths, you had DOs, doing either functional and or regenerative medicine practices that could at least give you the tools.
They talk about diet, they talk about detox, right? They talk about stress management, all these things that help, the body heal.
Diet, regeneration, the microbiome, gut health, all that stuff. And which basically that's the way that I learned, was piecing together sort of the picture of what the story was behind how I got to where I got, and formulating a strategy to inch my way out of it. It came from engaging in what I call medical tourism, right? Where it's just like, we exhausted everything around here, was trying to pull together information anywhere and everywhere I could. Then we went on the road and basically just started going to different clinics, different therapies around the country, outside the country, Mexico, like all over the place. We exhausted all the allopathic framework and the big clinics, the whole thing. And it just was, of course, taking us nowhere. It was just more drugs. There just wasn't, that framework is not set up for it. Allopathic medicine was more so, founded and framed up for acute episodal illnesses, infections and things that require surgeries. And it's great for that. It'll save your life. You get hit by a car and you need a surgery to save your life, or if you have a severe infection. But the problem is they tried to extrapolate that and create a business model to extend out into chronic illnesses, and in the early 1900s, and then it led to the development of all these drugs, and then into vaccines and all that stuff. And for the most part, there are, of course, times and places for all these leverage tools, because that's what pharmaceuticals are. They can gain leverage for periods of time. But health is not created by synthetic molecules.
Never. Well, health is always created from the inside out, never the outside in.
It's innate intelligence that we talked about, right? It's removing the interference and then feeding the innate intelligence, and that's
giving the body what it needs to heal.
Exactly. And so yeah, I mean, it was just one of those things where we had to travel around everywhere, and it took a lot of time and a lot of...
By we, who was with you? Were you...
My family. Thank God, because I absolutely would have been dead. Like, honestly, had it not been for a support system I had, because I was basically totally dysfunctional. I couldn't work. I had no resources. I'd exhausted everything that I had accumulated. And so I had to move back in with my parents and just be wasted down to nothing. And I was basically...
They're probably so worried about you.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was a absolute nightmare, especially when things got so bad where I was near death and wasn't walking and wasn't doing all this stuff. And I was having these crazy... Part of what I was experiencing that made it so terrible was this autoimmunity got so bad. When you have an autoimmune condition that's this bad, it's basically like the body has been so traumatized that it's basically rejecting a number of different things that's coming into...
It's attacking itself.
Right. And so the immune system is like, and again, there's breakdown of communication, so it can't formulate intelligent responses. So it just basically flails out and starts shooting missiles everywhere. And then you get the situation that can start with it just rejecting certain, like just, creating inflammation internally and sort of rejecting things coming in contact with it, like at a low grade level. But at the severe level that I was at, it got so bad where my immune system and my nervous system was rejecting almost everything that I was eating. So you develop a lot of these autoimmune conditions where you have the gut breakdown and leaky gut and all this stuff.
You get food intolerances, food sensitivities, yeah.
Crazy food tolerances, which are so common today in kids and adults and everybody. And a lot of it is this leaky gut and autoimmunity. But mine got so bad because food intolerances can be anywhere on a spectrum from mild, where you can barely sense the symptoms, to severe, where everything you're eating is giving you full-blown anaphylaxis or a seizure. And that's where I was. Right. So I was literally having like 10 seizures a day, and basically got to where I lost all my foods. And that's really where I almost died, because I was in intensive care. And I got to the point actually where my body even started rejecting water. I would literally put water on my tongue and I'd go into a crazy convulsion. I didn't even know that was possible. It's crazy. So, I mean, you see it. There's this term that was sort of banded together probably back 30 years ago or so to describe like the most poisoned and sick and autoimmune driven like patients, and they call it environmental illness, and in some places they call it Gulf War syndrome, because a lot of ex-vets from the Gulf War got exposed to so many chemical weapons, weaponized from trichothezene, like from mold toxins and stuff, that they ended up with this crazy bucket full spectrum illness like this, and basically where you just end up highly reactive to so many things in your environment. Smelling like a chemical, a fragrance that someone has on can send you into a reaction. Cleaning chemicals, like almost anything can send you into a reaction when you're that sick. And I was in a community of people in Dallas, Texas. There was basically like this medical research facility for people who came from all over the world with severe environmental illness. So I was like quarantined, like before quarantining was a thing, in the sense like I was put into this room. There's basically like tile floors, tile walls, nothing that outgasses, and this one air purifier. And that's where I had to live with like a breathing mask for a period of time. It was nuts. So I was having 10 seizures a day. I was going down this road and all that. During this whole time, this was actually like years into it, because I would just continue to degenerate. Even though I was learning a lot, it's like, like everywhere I would travel, every, study that I would read, every doctor that I would talk to, I would get these little blocks of information, or let's just call them bricks, for example. And I always say that, and I was looking to rebuild my body, right? Indicative of, say, like rebuilding a house, right? And I always kind of tell people that whenever you're learning and trying to figure out a strategy out of an illness or trying to optimize your body or your life, a house is made out of bricks, but a pile of bricks is not a house. So you also have to learn the protocols, the strategies of how to implement and organize those things to where you get the cumulative effect of a multi-therapeutic approach, which really how people get their lives back, like clinically, because I've worked in networks of like a network of 3,000 functional medicine doctors now for developing protocol for the last however many years, ever since I got well. But how people really get well and actually overcome diseases is usually a multi-therapeutic approach. There's usually not like one single food, supplement, diet. It's the synergy, and it's sort of like baking bread, right? In the sense of, not that we're saying that bread is great to eat whenever you're trying to overcome these illnesses, but in the sense that when you're baking bread, you've got the yeast, you got the water, you got the flour. You could bake one of them, and nothing would happen. You put them together, put it in the oven, and then something happens, right? There's a synergy there. And it's the same thing with like these therapies, getting like these categories like exercise or movement, sleep, diet, and mindset, right? If you get an A plus, or if you get a B plus in all those categories, you'll kind of get an A in overall health. But if you're addressing diet correctly and supplementation correctly, and then you're layering in certain regenerative therapies and strategies and modalities, you find the right synergy. And eventually it turns on that cellular communication. It starts to detox and get rid of the interference, and then starts to feed kind of the intelligence. And then it slowly starts to sort of teeter your body away from disease and towards health. And it's really just, there's not any one way, but I found a combination of different strategies. Detoxification first, because what I learned is that the severity of these like really severe autoimmune conditions are driven by mostly neurotoxic illness. Like that's mostly what's causing the explosion of it. And it's pesticides in the food. It's a lot of things, but exposure to chemicals that bioaccumulate in the tissue, in the organs, and in the brain, and affect everything. And so finding a comprehensive way of clinically detoxing from a cellular standpoint, not like cleanses that just move a bunch of stuff, but actually working a system where you're using the right compounds that like get the cell to upregulate its detox, and then using binders in the gut. There's these push catch systems you can get through, like Quicksilver Scientific, that we use with doctors. But it was working a system that slowly lowers the concentration of accumulated toxins in the nerve tissue over a number of months to years. That was like the base of how I got well, right? Because clearing the landscape is crucial. Yeah, if you want to build a new house, you can't build a new house on top of a junkyard. You have to get rid of the stuff first, and then the landscape, and now you can start doing things. So the less toxic my body became, the more just the basic nutritious foods and the good building blocks and the supplements started to actually make some headway. And then on the back end, because I was so damaged from the whole process, doing things like stem cell therapy and hyperbaric oxygen therapy and PEMF therapy and peptides. Those things were like the icing on the cake that took like a foundation that was now clean, and we're able to sort of really rebuild it to like robust health. And, the whole process took probably 12, 13 years or so. But that was because a good portion of that, I didn't have the information. I had to.
Well, let's get to where you're at now with the Kava product. I want to hear all about it.
Yeah. So I came across Kava as one of the many things that was super helpful during that process because, like I said, I was having 10 seizures a day and I had this crazy nervous system, spastic, constant reactions that were giving me either low grade anxiety all the time because my nervous system was always in the sympathetic mode. I wasn't sleeping. I just had this massive sympathetic dominance. Basically, this environmental illness thing and the level of autoimmunity is like also overlapped and could be categorized as a severe form of PTSD because the body is so traumatized that's flailing out these reactive responses to not only lights and sounds and emotions and things, but also just foods and everything. So I came across Kava because I was having so many seizures and all that. I ended up back on pretty heavy doses of benzodiazepine drugs to control them just so that we could eat food, right? Which was a complete nightmare because, like we said earlier, these drugs are like borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today. And so basically what happens when you take a benzodiazepine, right? It's like you get the effect now, but then it sets up the habituation and the dependency cycle pretty quickly to where they lose their effectiveness at that dose. And then if you take them away, then if you were having seizures before, your seizures will go up like absolute crazy. So I went down this train, to get short-term relief in some emergency situations, and then ended up on the benzos and on that. Benzodiazepine, dependency and benzodiazepine withdrawal more specifically is like one of the most dangerous like clinical situations with a drug like you can experience. Jordan Peterson almost died from benzodiazepine withdrawal. He was out for almost like 2 years because of that. He talks about it a lot. It's kind of an epidemic in and of itself. So I was fragile, went on the benzos, went down that train, and I was at this like critical juncture where the drugs had lost their effectiveness. If I went off of them, my seizures would be lethal for sure. But they weren't even doing anything for me anymore. And so I was trying to find a way to naturally get leverage over my nervous system to get off of the benzodiazepines and also allow me to eat food and all this stuff. And honestly, it was looking like really dark because I didn't think I was going to find it. Because it's like, of course, I went down the medical cannabis route. I was trying anything that would add some sort of a Band-Aid that would hold my nervous system down without adding toxicity and habituation and making the situation worse. So I had come across a South Pacific Islander whenever we were traveling around to clinics and seminars and stuff, just kind of serendipitously. And I met him a couple of years before. Then when things were at their absolute worst, we got in contact again serendipitously for some other reason. And I told him where I was at, and I'm trying to find a way off it. And he asked me if I've tried Kava. And I said, well, I know about Kava, or I thought I did, because there's a form of it in the United States that they call Kava, and it's an extract form. And I kind of told him what I was trying, and he kind of laughed. And he's like, no, dude, that's not Kava. Like in our culture, like we have a traditional preparation that's the real thing. And then there's like kind of like Americanized versions of it that are like a shade. And, Kava in the capsules, it's not a bad thing. It's just usually a little bit more like chamomile tea. It's very, very subtle, very mild. And the traditional preparation, especially at high dosages and concentrations, when you prepare it from the roots of this plant that grows in Polynesia, which is what it is, it's much, much not only stronger, but also has just a depth in the effects profile that just has way more therapeutic application and hits more. It has a lot more therapeutic mechanisms, right, from what we see in the scientific literature now. So I was like, great, because I had read a lot about Kava and anthropological accounts and stuff, and it was like super sacred in Polynesian cultures. And I always thought that literature was really interesting. But then whenever I tried capsules, I was like, oh, it must be kind of like overly romanticized or hype or something. But whenever he told me this, I was like, okay, great. Like, how do I get a hold of some traditionally prepared Kava? And he had some family farms in Vanuatu where he was from, which is kind of like the home of where Kava comes from. It's been used there like for 3,000 years. And it's as widespread in the culture as far as its usage as coffee and alcohol both are in the United States. It's used as a drink and prepared traditionally from, like I said, the roots of this shrub-like plant with these beautiful heart-shaped leaves that they call the kava plant. And it grows like in huge amounts over in these islands, and in Fiji and Vanuatu and Tonga and Papua New Guinea, this chain of islands that makes up Polynesia, Melanesia, and this whole like strain of countries over in the South Pacific. And they use it for everything. They prepare a drink, and it's kind of like a muddy water drink, that comes out of it. So it doesn't taste great in that form, but they use it for weddings, funerals, spiritual ceremonies, social gatherings. And basically what it does is it's really a relaxing anti-anxiety tonic that also lifts the mood and opens the mind and gives this really interesting social lubricant effect at the same time. So it has effects very similar to alcohol, but also opposite in the way that it's non-toxic. It doesn't create habituation.
Not a depressant.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't muddle the brain chemistry, and it doesn't make you drunk like alcohol. So it's sort of like alcohol without the drunkenness and habituation and the side effects, but also it also kind of opens up your mind whenever you're on it. You feel, even in high dosages, it can be actually very euphoric, but it's like a natural euphoria. You're also centered and you feel totally sober. You feel like more of yourself, right? Instead of being drunk, which is so cool in a sense of when you use it like that for a social lubricant, it just creates this very authentic group atmosphere where everyone is just sort of better version of themselves instead of like drunk. And so conversation gets deeper and not more shallow like alcohol, does, like the more that people drink, right? Conversation gets deeper, conversation gets more introspective and interesting, and people connect thoughts and ideas better. And it has this entheogenic characteristic. And if people don't know what that means, it's sort of like what you get from psychedelics, but not the trip, not like the altered state. It's super, super interesting how it works. They call it a heart opener because it's like helps people connect. But what we love it for in the United States and what it's most famous for is its anti-anxiety effects. Later on, whenever I really dove into the scientific literature, which is robust, it's got like more studies on it than more scientific literature exists on kava than almost any other plant compound, which is crazy because it's still not very well known by most people. But outside of cannabis and ginseng and reishi mushroom, it's like right up there as far as the amount of research. So we know the mechanisms, and the mechanisms are similar. It plugs into the same receptors as alcohol and benzos for one of its main mechanisms. That's the GABA receptors. So it affects GABA, and GABA is like the main brakes of your nervous system as far as it's a chemical that's produced in your nervous system that's anytime you relax, anytime that you're able to be in a soothed state, a calm state, your body is producing and expressing the GABA pathway pretty powerfully. So like alcohol and benzos, they hit the receptors, but they don't like increase your body's natural production of it. They just spend, like we talked about earlier, what's there. And when you deplete that, you have no defense against stress, which is why the withdrawals are so horrific from those substances. And your body can flail and go into even seizures, and it can be dangerous if you go cold turkey. So it's known mainly for a social lubricant and a relaxant and a mind opener, and it also helps you focus so it doesn't like knock you out, but it relaxes you. I mean, because it's used for everything, and the traditional prep and what he kind of taught me and told me about. He had a family farm, my friend. He sent me like a freshly harvested, fresh, frozen shipment of kava, and then taught me how to prepare it. So I had to thaw it, and it was like freshly harvested, like a 20-year-old plant. So it was like a super medicinal, robust like strain. And it basically involves thawing it down and grinding it down into kind of like a more closely powderized form, but it's not dry in that form. And then you're squeezing it through the strainer bag, and you're with water immersion, heat, and pressure, you make this drink that's a grueling process to do, and it ends up looking and tasting like muddy water, but that's where the magic is. And so I started drinking it, and I didn't expect a lot. I was just like desperate kind of thing, because even heavy drugs weren't kind of doing things for me. But I started drinking it over 2 weeks, probably within 2 to 3 weeks. It's like I just like wasn't having seizures anymore. It was crazy. It was nuts. Like it was like, and the ones that I was having, it was like they were just like reduced in their severity. They were tolerable. And so it was like probably like 80-90% of the convulsion was just gone. So literally overnight, I could like eat foods again. So it's like, that's how it saved my life in a sense. It's not like that it was a magic bullet, but it nourished the nervous system and upregulated the right pathways that were depleted. And it gave me amazing leverage over this like very dangerous juncture that I was at. Right. So I was able to eat foods again. And all of a sudden I was able to take supplements, and I could implement, because the biggest problem that I was facing at the time was I had developed a good knowledge base and actually a good plan of how I would slowly get myself out of it. But I'd gotten so sick that I couldn't tolerate the detox, the supplements, the foods. I couldn't do anything. So once I got on kava, I was actually able to get off benzos, Xanax, Klonopin, brand names of those drugs so people recognize them. I was able to get off those in about 6 weeks. And it normally takes a year and a half to taper safely off these drugs for people that are on them because they can be so pernicious and hard to get off of. But because Kava, it just blew me away how easy it was. And I later learned, after delving fully into the scientific literature and just kind of becoming in love with the stuff because of what it had done for me, and talking to Indigenous Islanders and networking myself in with the Kava community and all that, I actually learned that biochemically Kava has this amazing effect by interfacing with the innate intelligence and through unique plant pharmacology that it's actually able to nourish those receptors while waking them up and giving you the acute symptom relief that a drug would to some degree, but by also repleting and feeding them instead of depleting them. So it's really, when people ask me all the time, they say, well, is Kava a drug? Because it can be used in recreational settings, but again, you're still yourself and it kind of has the upsides of a drug without the downsides. But it's not only is it not a drug by definition from that characterization, it's actually an anti-drug because it's an off-ramp from habituation. And there's a phenomenon called reverse tolerance with Kava that the Islanders have always called it that and known that. And it's coming from this process that I just described. And what that means is tolerance usually happens with any drug. Because like I said earlier, it's like a biochemical credit card. So the strongest that it'll ever be is the first time you use it. And then it starts to deplete your stores. And so you have to stimulate it and there's not as much there. So it's like, you drink alcohol the first time, it's the strongest, or take a drug. And then after that, you start to build a tolerance, you need more and more to get the same effect. Kava, because it's waking up and making the receptors more sensitive. And actually over long term, we see in the studies that it increases GABA receptor density in the brain too. So it's basically helping to rebuild the parasympathetic nervous system, which is like crucial. It's a great medicine for that. But because of that, the reverse tolerance, the weakest Kava will ever be is the first time you take it. And then it has this cumulative effect where it's helping to feed and nourish and restore the system. It's a beautiful medicine. And so I just started to get more and more balanced the more that I would drink it. And then I was sleeping better. And I felt my nervous system going in this place where I was able to heal. I was able to sleep. I was able to take the supplements and the foods and the this and that. And it really was a huge turning point for me in the recovery process.
That's an amazing story. Cameron, we have to wrap up this podcast. Can you just share with the listeners how they can find out more about this product?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to trukava.com. That's TRUKAVA. And tons of information, links to our coalition.
They can buy it online.
Yeah, you can buy it online. If you go to kavacoalition.org, then we have all of the studies and everything if you're interested in that. That's a nonprofit organization that's for implementing Kava into modern culture. But yeah. I mean, we have drink products, like a canned drink product. We've got powders that are coming out, that are going to be mixable, like drink mixes and that. And we've got all different forms of it there that you can look for. But it's an interesting, and there's links to a bunch of different podcasts. If you want to take a deeper dive on just its different applications or its cultural significance, both in just regular recreational settings and in medicinal therapeutic settings too. So
amazing. I mean, this was such a fascinating podcast. I really love how you just really got us from A to Z, the whole process. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Cameron. I really appreciated his passion, his enthusiasm, and his authentic story around his own health struggles and how he overcame those through his own grit and determination to heal himself, and now how he's able to help so many people through this product that he's created, TRU KAVA. If you want to find out more about the products or find them online, check out TRU KAVA. That's TRUKAVA, trukava.com, or all on the social media channels.